Get off your ass if you're unhappy about your situation and go do something about it. First Contact, Season 1, Episode 1. The journey begins. 038 to 044. This is what Ashley Matthew had to say about Indigenous people. That's easy, right? But how could it be different for Indigenous people? It can't, right? Everyone has the same opportunities. We are in Canada. This is a free and equal country. So why can Indigenous people just do the same thing? Good afternoon, my name is Elvia Gonzalez, and in this podcast I will discuss the growth and personal development of Ashley Matthew, a participant of the first season of The First Contact, a TV show whose purpose was to educate people and correct their misconceptions about Indigenous people. First, I'll start with some context for her. She is 32 years old, she lives in Ottawa, she likes to work out and owns a gym, and now she currently works as a personal trainer. In the past, she suffered abuse from her family and bullying in school, which made her struggle with her identity. She was alone in this time. She had to pull herself out of this situation. As someone who has experienced prejudice, discriminations, and complications in general due to her identity, one could think that she would be an empathetic person, a sensitive person, and that she could even relate in some ways to Indigenous people. But instead of using her trauma and her abuse as a way of being more empathetic, of trying to relate to other people, what she does is that she thinks, if I had to go through hard situations by myself, other people can do the same. If I had trauma and had to overcome it, other people should do the same. And she cannot imagine how other situations can be different, because despite being a woman and despite being part of the LGBTQ community, she also has white privilege. While I was researching for this podcast, I come across the term intersectionality, which explains that oppression has different axes, so you can be oppressed by your race, by your gender, by your sexuality, and you can be on the privileged side in one issue and on the oppressed side in another issue. Ashley in particular, she is a woman and she has suffered because of it. She is part of the LGBTQ community and she has suffered because of it, but at the same time she is a white person and she has white privilege. And this white privilege is the reason why, despite having trauma and having gone through complicated situations, she cannot connect with Indigenous peoples because her white privilege is blocking her from having that connection. And another thing that I learned while researching from this podcast is that a lot of the time white people don't even realize they have privilege. Even if they have experienced traumatic situations, because having privilege does not mean having everything easy in life or having everything handed to you. It doesn't mean that. What it actually means is that in the same situation compared to an underprivileged person, you will have an advantage. So it doesn't mean that nothing bad will ever happen to you, that everything in life will be good to you, but it means that a person in the same situation as you will have more disadvantage. For example, one thing that we learned watching this show is that the murder and disappearance rates of Indigenous women are much higher than those of white women. So an Indigenous woman who also goes through family abuse or through bullying has less opportunities to come out of her situation like Ashley did, because Indigenous women have less resources and have to face discrimination and has to face prejudice. For example, a lot of people like Ashley herself thinks that most, if not all, Indigenous people have drug problems, alcohol problems, and that they just want to be this way. So an Indigenous woman in her same situation might have not been able to pull herself out because she has a stigma surrounding her. At the beginning of the show, I thought that she was going to keep this mentality for her whole life, that for her whole life she was going to lack the grandfather teachings of humility and wisdom. These teachings basically mean that you will always obtain knowledge from different sources and perspectives and contrast them, that you will admit when you are wrong, that you will keep an open mind to your environment and to other people. Ashley had a very closed mind, so I thought she was going to remain that way. Fortunately and surprisingly, as the episodes passed, she kept growing and learning. She described herself as someone empathetic, and I doubted at the beginning. But as the episodes keep passing, she kept gaining these grandfather teachings. The first important point of change for her, in my opinion, is when they visited the Mosrak Dam Reserve. Before visiting this reserve, she thought that indigenous people were handed everything, that they were handed a lot of money by the government for no reason, and that they were doing nothing with it. She learned more about the taxes management and about treaties. When European colonizers first came to the Americans, they signed treaties with indigenous people, which were not respected. And to these days, they are still not respected. You can visit an indigenous museum in Mosrak Dam where they have a copy of the original treaty, which stipulates how the convivence and how European colonizers were supposed to make agreements with indigenous people's lands and how they were supposed to be together in a harmonious and equilibrated way, but those treaties were not respected. And the taxes and government help that indigenous people receive does not cover what those treaties says. Ashley used to believe that it was a lot of money, but she learned that it's barely enough and that indigenous people truly do their best to handle that money correctly and distribute it, but it's not hard. It's not easy, and that is because those treaties are not respected. Another very important learning that made her turn her head around is when she learned about residential schools. Like most Canadians her age, she had no idea about these places, about what happened in them, and how did they affect indigenous communities. At this point in her journey, she was already starting to open her mind, and fortunately, when she was listening to survivors' experiences, she was listening with open ears and trying to be understanding, empathetic, and sensible.